Futility by Wilfred Owen. Move him into the sun, gently. Its touch awoke him once. At home, whispering of fields half sown. Always it woke him, even in France, until this morning and this snow. If anything might rouse him now, the kind old sun will know. Think how it wakes the seeds, woke once the clays of a cold star. A limbs so dear achieved, a sides full nerved, still warm, too hard to stir. Was it for this the clay grew tall? Oh, what made fatuous sunbeams toil to break earth's sleep at all? It's May 1918. Wilfred Owen is 25 years old. He has just been discharged from Craiglockhart, a neurasthenic hospital in Edinburgh, where he was being treated for shell shock, or what we would term today as post-traumatic stress disorder. The memory of last year's horrors, being left for days among the bodies of his fellow soldiers, has somewhat healed. He's deemed fit for home service and is recovering further at Ripon, although the hair at his temples is now noticeably white, a permanent scar from the mental struggles with trauma. His dreams of being a renowned poet, however, are being realised, having met his poetic idol, friend and mentor, Siegfried Sassoon. He's now writing some of the greatest poetry of his career, including this poem, Futility. 6 months later, he'd be dead, a week before armistice. The tragedy of his death would leave a bruise on British literary culture that remains to this day. It would also see him cemented as the greatest poet of the First World War. Futility is first and foremost a lament. It's an elegiac poem about an unidentified soldier's death, told from the perspective of an onlooker. We aren't given much more detail than that, other than understanding how hopeless the situation is. This soldier's death represents every soldier's death, youth being sacrificed for the greater good, pro patria mori. But our speaker is beginning to question this, wondering why we are created if only to be destroyed prematurely. It's a First World War soldier in a very sophisticated and powerful way, communicating his despair to the reader. And Wilfred Owen knew better than most that the greatest way to convey despair is through pity. So if we actually take a look at the poem now and examine what makes it so successful, starting with the structure, we can see there are 2 stanzas that make up this poem. So a fairly short poem, and we would expect it to be more jam-packed with technical brilliance, which it is. We have 14 lines, immediately making us think of a sonnet, the 14-line most famous poetic form of all time, and we can speculate why Owen has chosen that. Probably for its familiarity, its nostalgic Englishness, because at this time most of Owen's desired readership would have been raised on Shakespeare, so it's something familiar and therefore more poignant. Futility isn't a sonnet though. Metrically it doesn't fit. It actually starts off trochaic and then slips vaguely into iambic. So this is a young man flexing the mould, and I like to think of it as reflecting the frustration of these young men at being forced to accept a fate that was decided for them. The poem is old and new, same people, same culture, new problems. Interestingly, if you look at the line lengths, you'll notice that the beginning and ending of each stanza have progressively shorter lines, and the middle lines are the longest. This creates a sort of building climax and dying fall as hope is confounded again and again. Looking at the rhyming scheme now, we can see multiple examples of what Wilfred Owen was famous for: his innovative and expert use of half or para rhyme. This just means when part of a word rhymes with part of another. So in the first stanza we have sun and once. The beginning of sun and once rhyme. And then we have the ending of once and France rhyming. And the repeated OW sounds of sown, snow, now and no. And the full rhyme of snow and no, creating a hard stop and rounding off that stanza neatly for the next one. It's the same story in the second stanza, with seeds and sides, star, stir, tall, toil, and then tall and all for the same hard stop. But it's actually even more genius than that, because Wilfred Owen thought about the pitch of the half rhymes themselves. And this is easiest to see in the last stanza, if we look at the vowel sounds in all the half rhymes. So, seeds, star, sides, stir, toil is E-R-I-E-Oi, which is short, clipped, higher pitched vowel sounds. If we compare that to the last full rhyme of tall and all, where we suddenly have nice, deep, rounded vowel sounds of this long A, this all. The effect of this is to hammer home that dying fall. We were teetering on the edge of hope, and finally the drawing down of blinds has come. And because it's a long sound, there's this feeling of being left hanging on the last line, which makes it all even sadder, I think. So moving on to looking at the language now. I'll go through the poem line by line, analysing each in turn. So it starts off trochaic, which implies an urgency, and the voice is seemingly addressing us, the reader, with the very first word, move, an action, an imperative. But all we've read so far is the title, Futility. So aren't actions futile? Well, if we read on, we're asked to move him into the sun, except we can't, because we're reading the words from a page in hindsight. We aren't actually there. We as the reader are being asked by the speaker to do something we can't do. Within 5 words, we are now feeling first-hand the futility of the speaker. This is what makes this brilliant poetry. The first line ends with enjambment, which means a line that doesn't break where you would expect it to. For example, if we were speaking the first line, we would include gently in it, because it sounds as though it's part of the first line. Move him into the sun gently. But including that would soften the power of the opening line, detracting from it. Instead, we have it as the first word of the second line. Gently its touch awoke him once. In the next line, at home, whispering of fields half sown. It's such a beautifully poignant line. You have the internal line rhyme of home and sown, making these 2 words stand out and reinforcing that feeling of longing and regret. Things are half done, incomplete because the life that completed them is no longer there. Always it woke him, even in France, until this morning and this snow. This is hammering home the tragedy of his death. Why now? Life has never failed him before. Why is it failing now? Then, of course, we have the introduction of coldness with snow, as though the coldness of death is beginning under the warm veil of sunlight. It mirrors the paradox of the weather. There is snow, even though there is warm sunlight, and there is death, even though there is life. This enforces this feeling of unfairness. If anything might rouse him now, the kind old sun will know. So this is almost a resignation here, as though the speaker now knows he's beyond human aid. If he can be saved, it's up to the sun and the elements that created life in the first place. The sun is described through personification as being kind as well as old, like a deity that has the power to save life. Think how it wakes the seeds. This is another reference to the natural world and the power of the sun to create and sustain life. There are these constant life and death, light and cold, these opposing forces throughout the poem. Juxtapositions, we would call them. Woke once the clays of a cold star, a biblical reference to the creation of man, as man was formed from the clay of the earth. The mention of coldness again is important here because the speaker is highlighting how the sun was once able to wake and breathe life into something that had gone cold. So it shouldn't be impossible to save this soldier's life, but in reality we know that it is. There's that constant tug of war between hope and hopelessness throughout this poem, making it more painful. Our limbs so dear achieved, our sides full-nerved, still warm, too hard to stir. These lines are so expertly written. Owen draws our focus to the most vulnerable and sensitive part of the human body. Our sides are extremely sensitive due to them being where our vital organs are housed, and vulnerable to damage, particularly beneath the ribs. We have a lot of nerves here too. The need to protect and shield them is ingrained in us, so it's shocking to learn that this soldier's sides will no longer stir. There's no response from one of the most sensitive parts of the human body. We understand fully then that he is dead and there's no hope. But we know that information in a very intimate and personal way. It also conjures up the feeling of vulnerability, the vulnerability of the human body, which we desperately try to protect from harm, and yet often harm finds its way to us despite our best efforts. Was it for this the clay grew tall? Oh, what made fatuous sunbeams toil to break earth's sleep at all? The final lines are a lament for the purpose of man and life in the light of death. Why were we created if only to be destroyed? And the question is an open one, left for the reader to answer. Something that most of us would find very difficult to do.